Wow, this is such a great group. I welcome all of you to this special session of Religion 3, 5, 9, 8, 6. God as the God and the mystery of the world. And it is my great pleasure to welcome back to Charlottesville my friend and writing hero, Patricia Hampl, and to Charlottesville and to this discussion. We have quite a number of visitors today, and I would just like to tell all of you that you're all invited to a book signing and celebration at 5 o'clock this afternoon. It's at our home on University Circle. I will at some point put the address up, 1841 University Circle, but that's from 5 till 6:30. We'll have beverages of all sorts and snacks and perhaps a more intimate time to meet and converse with the luminous, brilliant, certified genius, Patricia Hampl. So for those of you who, I'm just going to give you a rambling, semi-coherent, hopefully brief introduction that also gives those of you who are visitors today a sense of what we are about as a class. But for those of you who are coming today for this open public discussion, you might want to know that you are joining a class in progress, really the last week and a half. Next Tuesday is the last day of class of a course called God and the Mystery of the World. It's the second time I've taught this course with a title so ambitious and so open-ended. It's an opportunity to just bring a group of talented students together and read books in sort of religion and experience that have shaped me and that I hope in turn will inspire students. And it is my pleasure to sort of introduce this group of 25 remarkable undergrads to Dietrich Bonhoeffer, to Simone Weil, Rudolf Otto, Patricia Hampl, Howard Thurman, Vittorio De Sica, great filmmaker. We saw his amazing Miracle in Milan last week. Anne Ulanov, who was a psychoanalyst and theologian. Stanley Levy, also a psychoanalyst, and other books that I can't recall off the top of my head. But what a perfect way to finish the semester. This Art of the Wasted Day, in so many profound ways, brings to a closure, and well, not closure, but to some kind of lovely synthesis, the conversations and explorations of the semester. And those of you who are also guests today, you'll also be expected to turn in a short reflection by 5 o'clock this afternoon. The rest of the class on Patricia Hampl's book. Or should I say masterpiece? Oh my goodness. I love every sentence and every phrase, every word of every book Patricia Hampl has written. A copy of Spillville up here, which is a little miraculous book about Dvorak in Iowa. I mean, and it's really kind of hard to find. Milky editions, but it's so beautiful. Her I Could Tell You Stories, Sojourns in the Landscape of Memory, inspired me, if I may, at a time when I was trying to muster up the courage to write memoir and to tell other people's secrets, to reckon with the inevitable treachery that comes with autobiographical and biographical writings. And there's one line from that book that still pounds me every time I recall it. It's something along the lines of the parallel lines of memory and imagination clash and collide finally in narrative. The casualty is the body of privacy lying smashed on the tracks. Just love that. In any case, her new book, The Art of the Wasted Day, some of you may have heard Maureen Corrigan's rave review yesterday on Here and Now on NPR, is a masterpiece, but it's also a miracle of sorts. And we were introduced last week to the theme of imminent miracle. Vittorio De Sica, this great neo-realist Italian filmmaker, in this gorgeous film called Miracle Milan, crafts this theme of an imminent miracle. The sort of shanty town and the occupants of the shanty town outside of Milan are, after undergoing one brutal oppressive act after another from the capitalist personified by a man named Moby, a big kind of, well, he reminds us of some, I was thinking he reminds us of someone else that we have to deal with every day, but I shouldn't politicize the classroom. Are finally transported miraculously to heaven on broomsticks at the end of the film. But as we wanted to show, the miracle in Milan was more about the crafting of this community of play, of poverty, of leisure, that resisted the kind of commodity-driven drive of kind of pressures of the labor economy that existed outside Milan. And this exploration of leisure and contemplation, which is your book, is a beautiful literary rendering of that film. And if you don't believe me on the miraculous and luminous and just altogether like helpful, cathartic effect of your book, I'll share briefly a few of my students' responses. Okay? A gorgeous, meandering miracle. Lush, fluid, poetic. These came in at midnight. A more graceful and generous recasting of Simone Weil's Waiting for God. A philosophical musing on the day-to-day interactions of modern life. A literary sabbatical. An antidote to the measurement and something, I can't read my own handwriting, to the kind of culture of measurement and economic quantification. An inner rebellion against the notion of daydreams as a sin. I like that one. An inner rebellion against the notion of daydreaming as a sin. A gentle reminder to recall a great unknown and rather barren, I like this one. It was, for me, one of my students, a gentle reminder to remember or recall a great unknown and rather barren corner of Virginia, home to me, that I had never thought could be a place of solitary openness. And now, through this book, I have recalled this forgotten landscape as my own solitary space. One student, if you don't mind my just reading this, because it's like he must have been listening to your fellow Minnesotan, Bob Dylan's early music, when he wrote this line. And you'll have to help me out because I actually can't figure out what you're saying here, but it's just so awesome. Hampl's cutting analysis of the modern American with their to-do list, gargantuan, never to be finished hydratic in its trimming, then eventually overgrown, return cut deep in me, and it just goes on like that. It's just like, wow. You need, Bob Dylan with the sign. Anyway, I could go on and on. A countercultural revolutionary summons to languor. This is one of the students' response. To a book that, in my own experience of having spent a couple of days with this, invites us to listen, to pay attention, to see. It's a book that invites you to put the book aside. I think of Nietzsche's.
Don't do that.
I think of no, but I think of Nietzsche's, line in I think it was Willpower, when he's talking about the kind of habits of ravenous reading that seem to pass for intellect and taste, and his response is, I want to learn to read slowly, to ruminate on the word. And I cannot recall a book since the last Hampl volume I read that has such an effect on me. To live the truth of, may I introduce Dietrich Bonhoeffer one moment here, of Bonhoeffer's wisdom that authentic encounter with God, life, beauty, reality begins with silence and stillness, and that we need to recover that silence and stillness and leisure that produces clarification, purification, and concentration upon the essential theme. So thank you for joining us this afternoon, and wow, what an honor, what a gift. Patricia Hampl.
Never be without your cell phone, right? I'm really very happy to be here. I've come from Minnesota, where we had 18 inches of snow a week ago, just before my publication date, which I shared with James Comey. We won't talk about our Amazon numbers, his and mine, but anyway, I want to thank Charles Marsh. I hope you know what you have in him here. He's a dynamo, and he makes a lot of things happen for a lot of people. This book actually got its start, believe it or not, quite some time ago, thanks to the Project for Lived Theology and a telephone call I received from Charles inviting me to join a small group of writers, most of them scholars. In fact, I was the only one who wasn't a scholar. I think they were looking for, sort of an outrider or something, who gathered for a period of 5 years to talk about our books. And my book ended up being the last one to come in. I mean, always, I meet my deadlines usually, but this time I was the last one. So I'm very grateful to Charles and to the project that he founded to make it possible for me to meander, I certainly did, into this book. When I started working on this book, I thought I should have a justifiable and recognizable religious subject. I don't happen to like the word spirituality. I think it's a kind of weenie word. It's a word that people use when they don't want to use the word religion, and I'm more interested in religion. Spirituality is your own business, but religion is what brings people individually and in some kind of aggregate together in relationship to the world. So religion is a word that I prefer to use. But then I thought, religion, well, I'm a Catholic, and most of the people in this group are not Catholic, or as we Catholics say, non-Catholic, because, sort of the detritus of all the others, just if you aren't Catholic, you're a non-Catholic. Anyway, everybody else was a Christian of some undesignated ilk. And I thought, well, you know what's really interesting is the whole idea of heresy. And I came up with a title I liked, which was, excuse me, The Virtue of Heresy. And I was going to talk about how, you know, being an outrider in a religion was a good thing. And, well, this was sort of getting me nowhere fast. And eventually, I began to think about people who had lived in that kind of circumstance. And the one who came to mind, partly because I am a writer and I write essays, yes, and memoirs, but we'll talk about that in a minute. In fact, that's the majority of what I want to talk to you about, was Michel de Montaigne, the great French writer, philosopher, as he was called at one time. Philosophy departments don't tend to study Montaigne. Why? Because philosophy kind of gave itself over, if I can make a sweeping statement here, to science and to the kind of legitimacy that the secular world has ascribed to anything that will be willing to call itself science. Social science, you know, all of these things want to look like they're making good sense and they have a skill that they're teaching. Montaigne was saying, I'm just go into my room and kind of write stuff down, or think about them and maybe write them down and maybe not. He called the things that he was writing down essays. And of course, as you know, the word essay in French, the word, you learn it early in French, essayer simply means to try, to attempt. The word he used was not the word we think of with a freshman theme or the way you get into college, your freshman essay. No, it was instead, he could have said my thingamajig. It could have been, it was just my whatever. That was what he thought he was writing. In so doing, bringing the personal voice, mind you, not the autobiography, the personal voice, but not, he doesn't spill any beans about his life. He spills the beans of his mind. So we don't get a lot of stories in here, couple, but in his book, I mean. But what he did revolutionized letters for literature, really, to this day, because he created the space in which it was okay to write something out of your own mind that didn't necessarily even have a beginning, middle, and end. It just portrayed your consciousness. So he was beginning to give us the notion, unconsciously perhaps, that your life is not what you do, but what you think about what you do, did, haven't done, won't do, might do, could do. All of those versions of your consciousness. So instead of experience being yourself, consciousness is yourself. It creates a much bigger, broader kind of context. So once I was working with Montaigne, who lived through the great wars of religion of the 16th century. As a faithful Catholic, many of his relatives went over to the dark side, to the Protestant side. He remained friends with both the Catholic king and the Protestant king. He remained a kind of interesting, open space, safe space where people could come together. Those wars never ended during his lifetime, so it wasn't that he solved anything, but he remained a presence. So with that in mind, I began thinking, because many books of this nature require some kind of spine. You know, novels have plots, right? But a book like this, how do you keep it going? How do you keep it aloft? And one of the ways to do that, because our most ancient metaphor is life is a journey, is to go on a journey. Because once the reader knows you're going on a journey, feels that something's at stake. Are you going to get there? Are you going to? So I set up in this book early the notion that I'm going to go and visit Montaigne's tower where he did his writing. But of course I keep you waiting, and we go to other places, other heroes of leisure over history and time. While I was writing this book, which probably by now you think, oh, it sounds pretty heady, you know, I mean, do I really want to read this? I mean, some of you, whether you did or not, you did, because you were in the class. But, you know, I was very engaged in these ideas. They were passionate for me, but during the period that I was doing this, my husband of many years was getting weaker and weaker and sicker. He had a congestive heart failure and emphysema. And although he wasn't supposed to, we weren't expecting him to die, he did die. And as a result, he ends up being in this book as a kind of silver thread that is going through it, or so I like to think. It keeps the book moving in a way. And it's very interesting. I've heard novelists talk about how they, a character took over, you know, when they were writing a book. Oh, so-and-so came in and just took over the book. And I thought, man, that's never happened to me. I mean, I'm just, you know, subject, verb, object, you know, push them out there. And so I never had that experience. But in this book, and I might just read you that little patch in a bit, there's a scene early in the book in which and this was after my husband had died, in which I'm describing something on an airplane, and my husband takes my hand briefly. And I only have him doing that for narrative purposes, which you'll see in a minute. But it was as if once his hand came in, the rest of him came along. And so from then on, the conversation that exists between my memory of him and my memory of my life with him and these questions of leisure came together in what I hope is some kind of, I wouldn't exactly call it a dance, but some kind of promenade anyway, through these questions having to do with leisure. Well, what does this have to do with religion? Aside from the fact that, let us remember, that one of the 7 days of creation is given over to doing nothing. And it's often said that the Jews keep the Sabbath, but really the Sabbath keeps the Jews. That notion that the nothingness of a day, a time, an hour, a moment, is in fact the all that we're all after. This is probably what's predicating my ability to treat this as my Project on Liv's Theology book. Heresy kind of went by the boards. I realized that didn't have the kind of juice in it that mattered to me, but the idea of leisure suddenly opened up in a way, because the final leisure, of course, is death. And we say rest in peace. We say these things so that they're cliches. We don't even think about them. But the truth of the matter is, somewhere in our linguistic intelligence, we understand that there is rest ahead, and that's what we're really after. That's our destination. I also wanted to say, because I'm assuming the majority of our time we want to talk to each other and have questions and answers and protests, if you wish. But I also wanted to talk a little bit about the whole idea of the first-person voice in our times in writing. There was a time, if I had been standing here 10 years ago, because it's 30 years ago. Yeah, What's 1981? That's a long, yes, a long time. But that's over 30 years, isn't it? We're coming on to 4. That was when I published a romantic education. 37. Anyway, in 1981, I published a romantic education. It was not considered a memoir, either by me or my publisher. The word did not appear on the front of the cover. It was an odd duck book. It was a Cold War book. I went over to Czechoslovakia it was Czechoslovakia then, behind the Iron Curtain to see, I thought, where my family had come from. Yes, the reason there's no E in my last name is because it's a Czech name and they don't really care about vowels all that much. So anyway, I wrote that book, Cold War, and wrote a couple more books. And then when I would go into, I should go back to 1981, when I would go into bookstores pretending to be looking for somebody else's book, but then would, be looking around for, did they have my book? And go up to one time I went to New York at the old Scribner's, which is now I think a Sephora or something. I went in and I said, would you happen to have a book called A Romantic Education by Patricia Hampl? And the clerk said, why, did you write it? apparently they've been used to people like me wandering in and pretending. Anyway, I could never find the dang thing because it was sometimes it was in European history, travel, women's studies, art history, and on one very unfortunate day, self-help. So I was writing in a non-genre is what I was doing. So I wrote a couple more books, and then I wrote another memoir, and I think it's the memoir that probably brought me to your attention for the project for Lived Theology, which was called Virgin Time, a line from Thomas, not Thomas Mann, not Thomas More, Thomas Merton, in which he talks about the early moment of the day before the birds sing, le point vierge, the virgin point being the moment most receptive to everything, to God, to the presence of some kind of experience of spiritual life. And I love that title. It was a terrible title, in fact, because people either thought they were getting a dirty book or, and they were very disappointed, especially when they put a bed on the cover. I mean, what were they thinking? Anyway, so that book, when I went into the bookstores, 10 years later it was, 1992, 11 years, bam, memoir, autobiography. The book, the genre existed, and my book was in it. What had happened between that decade? What had happened was what people come to call the memoir explosion or the memoir renaissance or whatever it is. The truth of the matter is that the memoir is the autobiographical piece is a much older form than the novel. Augustine sits down in 397 in North Africa to write the Confessions, which is generally considered what we consider the first autobiography in Western literature. There had been earlier ones, but they tended to be more they weren't inquiring as much. They were more meant to inspire people. But there's Augustine. He's 10 years converted. He's a bishop. And what he's saying is not, oh, here how great it is that I converted. He's saying instead, where is God? And like, how do you get in touch with him? And maybe, I mean, does anybody know anything about that? I mean, in other words, he was completely at sea, and he wrote a book about it. So that was 1992. And what happened was a lot of people began writing books that would have been maybe autobiographical novels began to turn out as memoirs. And we can talk about lots of sociological, cultural reasons for the rise, as they say, of the memoir at that time. One is we could talk Turkey about a lot of things that we didn't used to talk Turkey about. We were willing to spill more beans, and I don't say this as a compliment. It wasn't that we were writing more truly or more honestly. It's just we had decided that we could do things in our own name that we could not do before, that we used more of a veil for. It's possible that the novel made things more true than the memoirs that came out. So what I'd like to suggest is, though, that even though the memoir is riding high and doing well out there, that is not really what happened most importantly with the rise of the memoir. What really happened was the first-person voice began to move through the culture in an authoritative way. Look at the newspaper 20 years ago. Look at the op-ed pages. Just a little experiment. There's a PhD thesis waiting for a dissertation waiting for you. Look back to the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and look for the first person. I this, I that. When my father, you won't find it, typically. But now you hardly begin an op-ed piece without finding somebody referencing something. Tom Friedman is always saying, in a taxi cab in Beirut, the guy said to me, and off he goes to talk about something much larger. In addition, we know that as Americans, we love the first person voice. We trust it against all the evidence. That is to say, the evidence that people lie, they self-serve, they hide, they traduce, all those things. But we trust it because, well, why, I don't know why we do. We just, oh yeah, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We believe ourselves, more than any other nation ever, to be individuals who happen to have gathered together. And that's, of course, our problem. We don't often gather together. We are more interested in being individuals. And it gets more and more complicated as there are more and more of us and we're stuck in closer circumstances with each other. There's no mistake that our greatest poem is called Song of Myself. It's not an autobiographical poem. You don't learn that Walt Whitman was gay, was in love with a bus driver in Washington, D.C. You have to read his biographers to get that experiential stuff. But boy, do you ever get a sense of his consciousness. What I assume, you shall assume. And he also says, do I contain contradictions? Very well. I've forgotten the exact line. Somebody remembers it out there. I contradict myself, thank you. Well, very well, I contradict myself. In other words, he says, I don't have to make logical sense here. I don't have to be a character in a novel who just does certain things. I'm all over the place. And even if he's pop, Mom is also a first-person person. This is my letter to the world, never wrote to me. Emily Dickinson, for all the difference stylistically from between her and Whitman, there's also that first-person consciousness, that individual ramrod quality. Our novels also. Probably our three greatest novels, the kind of classico novels of the American experience, are all faux memoirs. Call Me Ishmael. And that launches that great whale of a book. And then, of course, Huck Finn is a first-person narration, and my own favorite, my homeboy, F. Scott Fitzgerald. You take away Nick Carraway's narration of The Great Gatsby, and what do you have? You have a kind of implausible, nutty guy in love with an airhead. You put him in, and you have a great myth about America moving from an agrarian ideal into an imperial position in the world. So this first-person voice is something that we say, yeah, I'm there. I am so there with that first-person voice. So it's both a lyrical voice, and it's also a voice that says, it's kind of the voice that says, I don't know much about art, but I know what I like. It's one of those voices that has authority just because it says it's me. And that voice has become, for good or for ill, I'm not making a case here for, that's for you to think about. For good or for ill, that is the voice that we tend toward, I would say. Take a look at all of what you read and see where you find that individual first-person voice, either with the letter I, or sometimes even without it. You can feel, even in the use of the language, that there's a quality of an individual consciousness at work. So the rise of the memoir has, of course, an incredible position in religious writing, too. Oh, do you see that little finger come in? So there's something inevitably religious about these first-person narrations. And sometimes they can be problematical, and sometimes they can be instructive, and sometimes they can just be boring. Because, of course, the thing that's easy to say about memoir is it's self-absorbed, it's self-referential, it's self-regarding, and who do you think you are? But one of the things that's really interesting about I'm going to not say memoir, I'm going to say personally voiced nonfiction. whether it's the memoir or the essay or some other thing, is that we have in these personally voiced documents, we bring forward a part of culture that seems to have gone away from the novel. Do you ever think about the novel as having ethical problems? Not really. You just make stuff up. You either like it or you don't like it, but that's it. With the memoir, you can get in big trouble because there are basically two goalposts that we play between. One is, are you telling the truth? Oh, wait a minute. Is it even possible to tell the truth? That's one goalpost. The other one is, who do you think you are? Does your mom know what you have just said? Those two have to do with truth and decency, the idea of loyalty and appropriate, your appropriate right. We don't ask if somebody has a right to write a novel or a poem, but we do ask, and trust me, my own students come shagging into my office to ask if they have a right to talk whatever turkey it is that they want to talk. And aside from saying the obvious thing, don't worry, darling, it'll never get published, so just write whatever you want, we'll deal with the publishing later. And I'm proud to say many of my students do publish beautiful books. But, to separate those two things, beyond that, I think that these two so-called problems bring to the writing of the first-person voice in our times a kind of electric excitement that often is lacking in some of the other forms because they're just arty. This one is trouble. We're in trouble here, or we could be in trouble. Your mom, a beautiful memoir by a dear friend of mine named Helen Fremont, After Long Silence, brought up Catholic by her German parents who had emigrated after the Second World War. And she discovers late on, and they would go to Mass every Sunday, and at the consecration, the parents would say, okay, come on, let's go. And the two daughters would say, well, everybody's going up to communion. And they would say, it's just an American thing. Come on, let's go. And it turned out they were Jewish. And they absolutely did not want their daughters either to know they were Jewish or in any way, because why? They had been in the concentration camps, of course. She wrote her book. It's a gorgeous book, After Long Silence, Helen Fremont. She was kicked out of the family. Mother dies, father dies, not allowed at the house, not allowed to say goodbye, not allowed to go to the funeral. Didn't get any of the do-re-mi either. I mean, she's absolutely, what do you call that when you kick somebody out of your family? What's that,
We don't do that.
What? What's it called? Disowning. She was disowned. It's like something out of a 19th century novel. Why? Because she wrote a memoir that was true. And I have another friend who wrote a book whose sister wouldn't speak to her and said, you told all our family's secrets and they're all lies. So, and my own experience, which I've written about too, is that while my parents were very loyal to me and everything, was that there were people that I did lose, friends I lost over various things. And my advice to you is you do fall into this art form or this scam or whatever it is these kinds of books are, that you don't think you're going to be able to figure out who will be angry at you. It's always somebody you didn't expect. It's always somebody you thought, well, what do they got going here? I mean, in fact, somebody once dropped me because I didn't put her in a book. I mean, so anyway, I just want to throw those ideas out about the memoir, about the first-person voice in our times, and how, curiously, the way it gets wrapped on the knuckles for being self-absorbed may be the least of its problems and the least of its true identity. It may be the place where you can actually reach out from yourself not to write about yourself, but to use the self as an instrument to investigate something. It might have to do with the predation of the environment. It might have to do, as it does usually for me, with history. It might have to do with some of those big ticket items that you feel you don't have the authority of voice to speak about, but which, when you speak out of your own experience, you are the only authority. And so, in a curious, paradoxical way, if you can absorb the usefulness of the self, not as a subject, and definitely not as a hero, but not as a subject, but as an instrument, you might find that you've got a useful way to navigate. Okay, so this book, I want to just read a couple of things, and why not start at the beginning? And you'll see that there's all this yakety-yak about the first person voice. I begin purposely in a much cooler voice, so you don't yet know that there's going to be a me coming in. I did that on purpose. Sometime around 1535, a good 30 years before the French wars of religion staked Catholic and Protestant heads on pikes around the Bordeaux countryside, in a gray stone castle deep in the wine country near Bergerac and Saint-Emilion, Pierre Montaigne, of a recently ennobled family, took the unprecedented step of hiring a lute player to awaken his child every morning. He was not an educated man, but he was an ardent father. He followed a theory, probably picked up during his military years in Italy, his son later wrote, that it troubles the tender brains of children to wake them in the morning with a start and to snatch them suddenly and violently from their sleep, in which they are plunged much more deeply than we are. The lute followed Pierre Montaigne's boy, Michel, around the castle. I was never without a man to do this for me. Music, lyrical, wordless, was the soundtrack of his childhood, the ground beat of his existence, an inducement to reverie. Though he reports that his nature was always gentle and tractable, Michel Montaigne, celebrated in our time as the first modern man, and in English departments as the father of the personal essay, that most amateur literary form, confesses that he was in fact so sluggish, lax, and drowsy that he was a poor student when lessons required serious application. No one, he says, could tear me from my sloth, not even to make me play. He was otherwise engaged, floating in the charmed notes of a childhood lute, no doubt, lolling in the lap of leisure, adrift on fey melodies handed down from the Provençal lays of the troubadours. There was fugitive genius in this indolence. What I saw well, he says cannily, much later. And beneath this inert appearance nourished bold ideas and opinions beyond my years. Montaigne found his vocation early, companioned by music plucked on sheep gut as he went up and down the staircase of his father's cold house, the same stony place where, years later, he would return from a life at court to sit alone in a room with words to reveal his mind, or really to discover his mind. He divined early the value of being sluggish, lax, drowsy. He was not, as people now say, the first modern skeptic. He was the first modern daydreamer. The rest of the book is organized, because you kind of have to organize things, even though Montaigne didn't organize anything, and look at who he is, into a consideration of timelessness, and then the whole idea of how do you get to this idea of rest and peace and all of that. Do you go out into the world and be kind of what the French call a flâneur, just kind of wandering about and taking things in and looking about? Or do you stay? Do you stay in your room and just kind of keep a low profile? And those two those two alternatives become sort of the play between the two becomes sort of some of the, if I can use the word, plot. I want to say we're at about 12 minutes of 3. I don't want to spend more time reading things that many people have already read. Would it be time to open it up?
We could listen to your beautiful words all day.
Oh, you smooth talker, you.
I think it would be a nice time to see what's on.
Because if I launch in here, then I'm kind of, it's not like reading a poem. I'm kind of stuck for a few pages, and that takes a lot of time. So anyway, so your turn, my dear readers. Oh, I can also, while you're thinking, I can also say, it's, in my view, one of the reasons that the memoir has taken off, if it has, and of course I have a vested interest in saying that it has, is that fiction, American fiction in particular, it kind of talked its way into a narrative corner. How many of you have taken a creative writing course? What is the first rule that you're told in your fiction class?
Show, don't tell.
Show, don't tell. Very bad advice. It makes you so lonely out there, because the truth of the matter is we want, in the way those 18th and 19th century writers like George Eliot, my favorite, Thackeray, they would stop and they would say, "Dear reader," and then they would talk to you for a while about something that was going on in the life of the characters. We, meanwhile, keep people moving along. It's almost as if we want the novel to move the way a movie moves, just without stopping. The memoir said, you know what, I'll give you a story. You're going to get some stories, but I want to talk to you too. So there's an intersection between story and reflection, between narrative and what we can call an essay, whether it's just a little squib or it's longer. And that allows one to write what amounts to a dear reader relationship with the reader. So instead of just talking about me and what happens to me, I get to talk in a way that engages. So that's one of the reasons I think that people like the memoir. They feel the presence of the writer. They don't just feel, maybe to think of it this way, the novel becomes kind of a movie that won't stop, and you can't even, well, you can stop it because you can stop reading, but I mean, the action just keeps moving along. Whereas the memoir is more like a photo album that you keep. Oh, and I remember that time when we were having that picnic, and then somebody, it turned out we all got botulism, and most people lived, and so you can think about things, and that's what the memoir likes to do. It likes to think, not just to show. So, what do you think about what I think? No, what do you think about anything I've brought up? I hope I've hit a few things out there that you can bat back at me, either in a question or in an argument. Because those of you who've read this book,
so many wonderful responses that
I know.
I shared with you. I could just call on one.
Oh, he's threatening now. Sometimes it's difficult to talk after one person's been doing all the talking. Be brave. I think one thing to think about is what troubled you or even annoyed you? What made you stop in some way that you didn't, that gave you some trouble? That would be a good place to start.
Should I call on someone?
No, we just wait. Yes, go ahead.
I'm really good at that.
I'm not even a student. I'll just dive in.
That's why you're willing to talk.
I know, that's why
On you.
yeah, they'll get called on. I'm about halfway through your book, and I'm really enjoying it. And so I have lots of things that I'm interested in thinking about. But I was surprised when I saw this advertisement. I was like, religious. What does this have to do with any, you know, so, because I
Yeah.
wasn't coming at the book from that direction at all.
Mhm.
But when the references to your husband came out of, for me, it kind of came out of nowhere. I thought, well, I wonder how much, and now listening to you talk, how much of the overlap of sort of daydreaming, contemplation, and contemplation, grieving. Do you know what I mean?
Mhm.
Like there's a thoughtfulness to your writing. It's almost like, of course, your husband would come into this book. Do you know what I mean? I don't know that there's a question in there, but I wondered. I'm only halfway through, so I don't know where you go with it. But that early image of you as a kid under a tree, just kind of thinking about your neighbor and his life, and thinking about other people, right? So all of those factors of thinking about reflecting on one's own experience, but also reflecting on the kind and quality of other people's lives, and the way that they did or didn't daydream their way through parts of their lives. I don't know. I guess I was thinking about the connection between contemplation and grieving, of using that kind of reflecting, not just to daydream, but to kind of really process.
Well, you know, it's funny because I had read a few of the, what I refer to as the widow books, you know, and I hated them. I thought they were all so, oh my God, you know, they weren't, I just didn't like them. And I said, I'm never going to write one. I'm never going to write one of those. And then I think I even have the line in this book that says, but look at me. You know, I mean, it really was one of those.
You didn't write one of those.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that, you know, what happens when you're writing a book, if I may talk about composition for a minute, most of us become writers because we were moved deeply by reading. We love to read, oftentimes as children, or sometimes people come to reading a little later, maybe even as adults, but during a rough time, and they feel like they found a friend in some book, and they started to reading became a deal, a great comfort. But the truth of the matter is, writing could not be more different. And we when we teach writing, we always say the most important thing is to read. You have to read a lot, you know. Blah, 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 blah. But the truth of the matter is, there couldn't be anything more different from reading than writing. Reading is quite amazing. If I begin here, and then I go to the bottom of this page, the next page just follows. You know, it's all coming right in order. It's just amazing. Whether you like the book or not, it all kind of comes right. Well, when you sit down to write a book, the first page you write may end up being half of page 48. But you don't know that at the time. You have this fiction that you're writing the first page or the first chapter or whatever. Example is my thinking I was writing The Virtue of Heresy. Well, it turned out I had not really anything to say on the subject. It was kind of a cool title. I thought it was kind of a snarky title. But when I wrote about it, it wasn't going anywhere. So I think that is part of what happens when you're writing a book, is the book begins, you know, we tend to think of revision as, you know, you write and then you revise. But the word revise for most of us means fix it, stupid, because if you got it right the first time, you wouldn't have to revise. But in fact, it's a very beautiful word, revision, and it means don't do a thing. Just look. Look again, and let that piece tell you what it wants, what it's about. And so I think that that's what happened. I wouldn't say that I didn't feel like I was grieving as I wrote this, although it was right soon afterwards. I felt I was companioned. I mean, I liked being with my husband, and I got to kind of pretend that I was again. So that was, you know, not, it didn't have a mourning quality about it. It had just a companioned quality. I mean, I enjoyed sitting at the table and where are we going today? You know, what am I going to do today? That was more the spirit of it. Yes, Shane.
Kind of maybe both building on what you were just talking
Make
about.
sure they can hear you too.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm interested in what you were saying about, a book needing an organization or the kind of finding the arc when it's not a plot exactly. So for you, how do you go about thinking about structure as that book is sort of coming to the focus for
Yeah.
you?
Did you hear the question? Okay, about structure? Well, it's very interesting. As the reviews for this book have been coming in, one of the things, and they've been positive, but one of the, so far, but one of the things that said is, although it lacks a narrative arc, and I feel like, oh, another person who's gone to an MFA program and is learning about narrative arc, stop with the narrative arc already. I even talk about why there's not a narrative arc in here. But this is the thing, you narrative arc, narrative arc. I mean, I don't even think people quite know what they mean by the word. But how do you keep people turning the pages? How do you keep yourself aloft within a project? You begin to see big pieces, sort of, and this thing I read to you earlier, not read, but kind of quoted, that the first section is called Timelessness, and that's all about the experience in childhood of being, a daydreamer. And it's also about the experience of, as an adult, of becoming a to-do list person who's, has a panic attack on an airplane and, like that. And then to go, those two things I mentioned, to go and to stay. That organizational, kind of carapace or superstructure, I was counting on to satisfy the narrative arc people. But it turns out it obviously has not, because it's sort of like, although there's not a narrative arc, it's really an interesting book anyway. And I feel like saying, there's not supposed to be a narrative arc in this book. If you mean by that, the destination is like in a whodunit or something. I mean, it's very frustrating. So, but I can tell you this, that no matter how careful you are, a reader comes with his or her own assumptions. I got a very positive review, I mean, a rave, quite frankly, yesterday. And my editor's over the moon. Okay. Why did I think, oh good, I'm glad, fine. But there was a line in it in which the reviewer said, this wonderful scene and the skating scene in which Patricia Hampl, as a child, decides she doesn't want to have children. And I thought, not only did that not happen, but that scene is all about the opposite. And as a friend of mine said, some people don't know the difference between revelation and decision. In other words, it's true on the skating rink, when my friends are all talking about how many children they're going to have, this is a Catholic scene, they had like 8, 10, 12, and one, of course, was going to be a nun. But I didn't know what to say because I realized my number was 0. And that was not a decision. And the whole point of that couple of pages was that it wasn't a decision. It was like a fate knocking on my noggin. And so what do I take away from this fabulous rave review? That she got that wrong, So you can't control it. You just can't. Yes.
A related question, and it's about not so much the whole shape, but just maintaining suspense from piece to piece to piece, especially if you're moving the reader around in time.
Yeah.
I'm just curious if you have something
Well,
to say about that.
Yeah, I'm concerned about it, and how you do it has totally to do with the materials you're working with. So, for example, let me just see quickly, just because this isn't something one can talk about so much theoretically. It gets kind of boring. But let's say. In this early pages, I'm talking about the to-do list and how I'm overwhelmed and blah, blah, blah. And then I say, reprimand to self. You dare to complain about a life rich in tasks and duties and pleasures, rich with meaning? daily life, work you chose and profess to love, domestic detail, the call and reply of other people's lives, the beloveds mixed in there with everybody else who has a claim on you, the sheer wants and requests always heard as demands, the gnats of need buzzing, deadlines delivering always. And then I go on about this for a while. Memory is, I talk about the past coming to haunt too. Memory is a tough boss, a micromanager sending out many memos. Even the realization coming as a surprise, the shock of how happy you were in love for years, how long you were given to have and to hold, even though he's gone now. The bell of memory, the beautiful hand holding yours. And we've had that scene where he's holding it. Dust now. We'll get to that. So I say we'll get to that, but we don't get to it yet because I'm making you wait. So it's that kind of a little, hang in there, I'll get to it, but I'm not going to get to it now. I'm just going to tell you that we're going to get to it. And I guess that might be when I say dust now, that might be the first time it's clear that my husband is, that he's dead. Yes. So there's a piece of information that will, I'm not sure anybody's falling off the horse on the road to Damascus with this piece of information, but I mean, it's a little bit of a surprise. And then I'm going to tell you more, but then I don't tell. You wait. And you can notice that, those of you who are interested in working on writing your own books, you can notice this in your reading when a writer does exactly this kind of move, where there's coming along, and a stop and a promise. And see what that does to you as a reader. It probably means that you will give a little more time, to see what's going to happen next. So you feed out the information just a little at a time. It's a good reason to read mystery books because that's what they're all about. That's all that they're all about. So, anybody else?
May I speak a word on,
Yeah.
On behalf of my students? Just a question that came
Yes.
up in these responses. It's that this beautiful place to which you and your writing summon us is the opposite of the place where we live and work here. And students as overachievers, as success-driven, and men and women. One student said, I'm not naming names, but Hampl's work caused me to be overcome with questions that felt urgent and ethereal, and necessitated an emergency appointment with my therapist. I am so unused to hearing leisure described as a virtue. It was jarring and disorienting, and almost every student sort of mentioned that sense of, well, as one writes here, the American lifestyle implicitly and explicitly stated concentrates more on the action to achieve this happiness than the happiness itself. Thus the, quoting from you, essential American word isn't happiness, it's pursuit. So she asked, how is one able to rest and be in leisure, knowing woven into the very core of our national values is this constant striving for more and more happiness. And so, I think that we want to know how to inhabit this space.
Well, that's why I wrote the book. You don't write a book out of your knowledge and your strength, not this kind of book. You write it out of your weakness and your uncertainty and your desire and your confusion. I mean, a number of times, I think in this book, I have my interlocutor, who's my husband, say, you're the last person who should be writing a book on leisure. You're a workaholic, darling. And of course, that's exactly the truth. So I think that meeting the reader part way, it's not like, one of the things that has to be said about this, I'm playing with our use of how-to books, right, in this title, The Art of the Wasted Day. I wouldn't want anybody to put good money down thinking that there's going to be a list of things that you could do, and you'd be okay, you'd be at leisure, you'd be at rest. And it's possible that some of this has to do with, I didn't write this book when I was 30, 40, 50, 60. I'm 72, for God's sake. It's about time I start thinking about slowing down. And so I think that that might have something to do with it. I don't know that it's appropriate for a 20-something person, or I think even a 19-year-old person, to think about. But I would say this, that one day of the week is a Sabbath. One day of the week, one portion of your mind, one part of your consciousness ought to always belong to you. And this is, in a way, if there's a destination in this book, it has to do with that exchange at the end of the book, when my husband says that to me just before he dies. It's the quality, not that you lie in a hammock. In fact, when it came time to pick a cover for this, I said, no woman in a hammock. No woman in a 19th century dress lolling back and reading a book. No. I want a hot air balloon. And I got one. I wanted something up, buoyant, moving. And because it's not about falling into some kind of stupor. It's about, I would say ultimately what this book is about integrity. I mean, that's what I feel it's about. But I sort of don't get to decide what it's about now. I have my chance, and now it's everybody else's chance. Even the woman who didn't get it right about the babies, you know, not wanting children. That's not my place anymore. But for me, the question of how do you live a life of integrity, which is what Montaigne talks about too, and it's at the end of my book. This is Montaigne. We say, I have done nothing today. What? You have not lived? That is not only the fundamental, but the most illustrious of your occupations. And then he says, we are here to compose our character. This alone is our duty. Not to compose books and to win, not battles and provinces, but order and tranquility in our conduct. Our great and glorious masterpiece is to live appropriately. And the essay in which he wrote that was called On Idleness. So that to me is about, I mean, if I would say, well, what does it mean to live appropriately? It means to live with integrity, to have a sense that there are some things I do, some things I must do, some things I will do, some things I can be called upon to do, and some things no. No. And we're living in a period when, for many of us, there are lots of questions about which we need to have strong opinions, and we need to take action or not. Or not. Sometimes I have a friend, well, she's gone now, but I have a friend who used to say, when I'd come to her all vexed about something, she'd say, do nothing. Not do nothing, but do nothing. The idea that not to do something might be the most appropriate thing. To wait, to pause. We aren't big pausers around here. We get on that internet and get on there and blast somebody. So anyway, to me, that's what this is about, really.
One of the great Christian socialists of the late 19th century, Christoph Blumhardt, liked to say, get busy and wait.
Yeah, get busy and wait. That's perfect.
Yeah.
That's exactly right, yeah.
Well, we have time for one more question, Jessica.
Yeah, I was just curious, I feel like you made a really clear distinction between like this idea of idleness and laziness and like that of leisure. And I'm just curious where the title came from, because I feel like when I think of like wasting time, it's not necessarily a positive.
No, it's not a positive. Well, I mean, I can't remember where I got this title. I mean, I can't remember if it was in conversation with my agent, who also happens to be my girlfriend. She was maid of honor at my wedding. Anyway, I can't remember where that came from. But of course, the reason that I like it. The reason it kind of has some juice in it is because I'm playing against exactly that thing. The art of something wrong, the art of, we aren't supposed to waste the day. And so the idea of actually having an art form that would do that, I mean, it's a play on the word, and it's meant to provoke. It's meant to have you go like that at the bookstore and then walk to the counter. Do you see what I'm saying? It's a language thing, yeah. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Patricia Hampl. And we have some books here if anyone would like to purchase copies
right.
here. I know they're almost impossible to find. The first printing sold out immediately, and we managed to get a few from the bookstore. Well, of course, we'll have some at the house at 5 o'clock. So again, thank you, Patricia Hampl, for this
My
gift.
pleasure. I wish we had
thank you
talked
all
more,
for
so
coming.
come.
I invite you to the
address.
address.
The address.
Shall I write it on the board?
Yes.
I prefer, okay. Well, guests, thank you so much for coming. I just need to make a quick reminder to my students that the reading assignment for Thursday is a little unclear. So that essay by Wim Wenders and Mary Zernani on perception and seeing, it's in the last piece in your, really book handout. That's the reading for Thursday. You're all welcome back. So thank you again.
Thank you. Come to the Bonifer House so we can really talk.
I never can find